What if I told you the biggest boy band on the planet has a history filled with moments so bizarre you'd swear a crazy Hollywood scriptwriter made them up? Welcome back. Today we are diving deep into the wild, chaotic, and unbelievably real world of BTS. Behind their massive, record-breaking hits lies a past full of unbelievable plot twists. Are you ready to question reality? How did a trivial dumpling fight almost shatter an unbreakable bond? What insane, split-second coincidence literally saved their debut? Buckle up and prepare your mind because we are about to uncover the top 7 BTS stories that sound completely fake but actually happened.
Number 7. V, the accidental superstar, scouted in the shadows. Imagine for a second the sheer, mind-boggling concept of the butterfly effect, where the tiniest, most insignificant flutter of a fragile wing can cause a massive, destructive hurricane halfway across the globe. But in this bizarre real-life case, the hurricane is a multi-billion-dollar cultural phenomenon, and the butterfly is just a completely oblivious teenager from Daegu who only wanted to be a supportive friend. We are kicking off this jaw-dropping list with a story so fundamentally absurd that if you pitched it to a Hollywood executive, critics would laugh you out of the room for writing a lazy, unbelievable cliché. Yet it is the absolute, rigorously documented truth of how Kim Tae-young, universally worshipped today as V, stumbled into global superstardom completely by accident. The year is 2011, and the setting is Daegu, a bustling, intensely hot city in South Korea, far removed from the glitzy, high-stakes, ruthless entertainment factories of Seoul. At this point in time, young Tae-young is living a profoundly quiet, almost radically ordinary life. Raised primarily by his fiercely loving grandmother, he's a humble farm boy whose biggest, wildest ambition in life is to become a professional saxophone player. He isn't spending grueling hours in front of a fogged-up mirror practicing idle choreography. He isn't starving himself on ridiculous, soul-crushing trainee diets, and he certainly isn't staying up late dreaming of screaming stadiums, Grammy nominations, and Billboard chart domination. His daily reality is grounded in the damp soil of the farm, the simple, comforting warmth of his family, and the brassy, soulful notes of his saxophone echoing through the rural air. But fate, as they say, has a profoundly twisted, almost cruel sense of humor when it comes to rearranging our lives. One fateful, humid afternoon, a close school friend of Tae-young's nervously announces that he is going to audition for a relatively small, struggling, practically unknown agency called Big Hit Entertainment, which happens to be holding rare local auditions in Daegu. The friend is absolutely terrified. His palms are sweating buckets, his heart is racing out of his chest, and he begs Tae-young to come along purely for moral support. Being the incredibly loyal, easygoing, and sweet friend that he is, Tae-young agrees without a single second thought, viewing the trip purely as a spectator sport, a fun little afternoon outing to cheer on his buddy from the sidelines, while maybe grabbing a snack afterward. Fast forward to the audition venue. It is a chaotic, noisy, fiercely competitive environment packed to the absolute brim with desperate, hyper-ambitious teenagers dressed in their absolute best, aggressively practicing vocal runs in the cramped hallways, stretching their limbs in the corners, and eyeing each other with the fierce, unblinking rivalry of gladiators. Amidst this suffocating sea of raw, unbridled ambition stands Tae-young, entirely relaxed, wearing his everyday street clothes, probably looking a bit bored, casually leaning against a cold wall and just soaking in the bizarre, almost desperate atmosphere of the room. He has zero intention of singing, zero intention of dancing, and zero intention of ever stepping foot into that intimidating audition room. While guys like RM and Suga were out there grinding in the underground hip-hop scenes, writing lyrics until their fingers bled, Tae-young was literally just hanging out. But here is exactly where the universe steps in, hijacks the narrative, and hits the fast-forward button on destiny. A female staff member from Big Hit's rookie development team is frantically scanning the sprawling crowd, her exhausted eyes darting past the hundreds of polished tryhards when she suddenly stops dead in her tracks. Her gaze locks onto the kid standing in the corner doing absolutely nothing. Even back then, raw, unpolished, and completely oblivious to his own charm, Taeyoung possessed an ethereal, striking visual presence and a deeply magnetic, almost hypnotic aura that you simply cannot teach in any elite vocal or dance academy. The staff member, driven by an inexplicable gut instinct that would literally change the course of pop music history forever, walks straight up to this bewildered farm boy, cuts through the noise, and tells him outright that he needs to audition immediately. Taeyoung is stunned into silence. He awkwardly laughs it off, politely explaining that he is just there for his friend, he hasn't prepared a single verse or dance move, and more importantly, he is underage and absolutely cannot audition without his parents' strict, explicit permission. Now, in any normal, logical scenario, a busy, overworked casting director would just nod, move on to the next willing, desperate participant, and forget the strange encounter ever happened. But this staff member is relentlessly persistent, sensing a rare diamond in the rough that is so overwhelmingly unique she simply cannot let it walk out the door. She practically demands that he call his father right then and there. Picture this utterly surreal, almost comedic scene: a bustling, ear-piercingly loud audition hall, a confused teenager holding a cheap flip phone to his ear, and a Big Hit staff member passionately pleading with a bewildered father over the phone in the middle of a random workday, begging for permission to let his son try out for a small company he probably never even heard of in his life. Against all conceivable odds, the father eventually sighs, relents, and gives his hesitant consent. With zero preparation, zero polished routines, and wearing his casual clothes, Taeyoung casually strolls into the intimidating audition room under the harsh fluorescent lights. He does a little bit of clumsy but charming dancing, sings a raw song, throws in some random, quirky jokes, and perhaps even mimics playing his beloved saxophone, treating the whole high-stakes, life-altering evaluation like a playful, spontaneous joke. He finishes his impromptu performance, bows politely, and leaves the room, likely thinking he would never see these weird soul people again and simply hoping his friend did well enough to pass. Weeks pass, the dust settles, the anxiety fades, and the final results from the massive Daegu auditions are finally released to the public. Out of the hundreds of meticulously prepared, desperately ambitious kids who poured their literal blood, sweat, and tears into that audition hall, only one single person from the entire city of Daegu is selected to become a trainee at Big Hit Entertainment. Just one. And it wasn't the friend who dragged him there. It was Kim Taeyoung. The sheer, devastating irony of the situation is incredibly heavy. The friend whose ultimate dream it was, the friend who nervously initiated the entire chain of events, was left behind in the dust, while the boy who just went to watch accidentally unlocked the golden door to becoming one of the most recognizable, wealthiest, and adored faces on planet Earth. It's a literal cinematic masterpiece disguised as a real-life memory, a profound testament to the chaotic, unpredictable beauty of the universe, and it leaves you breathlessly wondering just how many other massive, world-altering moments are born out of sheer, absolute accidents, making us question if we are truly in control of our paths or if the universe has already written the script. But if you think stumbling into global, historic fame completely by accident is crazy, just wait until you hear the next unbelievable story on our list. A story so intensely emotional and hilariously absurd that it permanently altered the group's dynamic forever, proving that sometimes the biggest threats to a multi-million-dollar empire aren't massive scandals, but rather the most trivial, ridiculous things you could ever imagine.
Number 6. Jimin. The Great Dumpling War. a fight that almost destroyed everything. When you hear about legendary, world-famous musical groups going through massive, earth-shattering internal conflicts that threaten to tear their entire legacy apart, you usually imagine scandalous stories involving stolen royalties, massive ego trips, illicit substances, or bitter love triangles that belong on the front page of a trashy tabloid. But in the incredibly unique, intensely hyper-focused, and endlessly fascinating universe of BTS, the catalyst for what is arguably their most infamous and emotionally exhausting fight wasn't about money or fame at all. It was about a simple, wildly inexpensive plastic bag of convenience store dumplings, famously known in Korea as mandu. Yes, you heard that absolutely right, and we are diving headfirst into the legendary dumpling incident, focusing on our incredibly driven perfectionist, Park Jimin, a story that sounds like a ridiculously exaggerated sketch comedy routine, but is actually a deeply profound window into the extreme psychological pressure cooker of their early career. To truly understand the sheer, unadulterated madness of this moment, we have to desperately rewind the clock and plunge ourselves back into the suffocating, intensely stressful atmosphere of their old, cramped and humid big hit practice room around 2014, a time when BTS was not yet a household name breaking international records, but rather a group of desperate, exhausted, and incredibly anxious teenagers fighting tooth and nail for their very survival in the ruthless, unforgiving meat grinder that is the fiercely competitive K-pop industry. Back then, Jimin was not the confident, effortlessly charismatic global icon, fashion ambassador, and record-breaking solo artist we see today. He was a fiercely insecure, intensely self-critical rookie who was famously known within the company to practice dancing and singing until his muscles literally gave out and he collapsed in a pool of his own sweat on the cold, hard linoleum floor. He viewed every single second of practice as a matter of absolute life and death, driven by the haunting, ever-present fear that if he wasn't absolutely perfect, he would become a burden to the team, be cut from the group, and his lifelong dreams would instantly turn to dust. Enter his best friend and fellow 95-liner V, who had just arrived at the practice studio carrying a tantalizing, steam-filled bag of hot, savory dumplings, completely exhausted, physically drained, and desperately hungry from a separate, grueling solo filming schedule. V, acting on basic human survival instincts and running on absolutely empty fumes, wanted to immediately sit down, rip open the plastic bag, and eat his hard-earned food before starting the intense, physically demanding choreography routine. But Jimin, fiercely locked into his hyper-focused, do-or-die practice mode, immediately shut it down, stubbornly insisting with ironclad authority that they needed to finish their grueling dance practice first, push through the pain, and eat the dumplings later when the work was completely done. What started as a minor, slightly annoying disagreement over a simple, trivial snack instantly, violently escalated into a full-blown, screaming, earth-shattering shouting match that echoed aggressively through the narrow hallways of the entire big hit building. You have to deeply realize that this wasn't really about the dumplings at all. It was the explosive, inevitable eruption of months of chronic sleep deprivation, terrifying uncertainty about their future, aching joints, extreme diets, and the incredibly complex emotional dynamic of two same-age best friends who were dealing with unimaginable, crushing stress in completely opposite ways. In Korean culture, being same-age friends, or chingers, means there is no strict senior-junior hierarchy to diffuse the tension, meaning Jimin and V could fight as absolute equals, holding nothing back. The tension in the room was so incredibly thick, so aggressively toxic, and so genuinely alarming that the other members, who were usually quite used to their everyday petty bickering, actually had to urgently intervene. Leader RM and the older members, completely fed up and exhausted themselves, forcefully kicked both Jimin and V out of the practice room, strictly ordering them to go outside, get some fresh air, and resolve their childish dispute before they ruined the entire team's desperately needed rehearsal time. Picture this utterly absurd cinematic scene that feels straight out of a coming-of-age indie film. Two future billionaires, two remarkably talented young men who would eventually address the United Nations and sell out the massive Wembley Stadium in minutes, furiously glaring at each other in a cold, lonely park in Seoul, aggressively debating the incredibly trivial logistics of eating a pork dumpling. The argument dragged on for hours, looping in furious, exhausted circles, eventually leading to Jimin dropping the now legendary, deeply emotional line, "I'm only doing this because I care about you and our team," which, while deeply sincere and coming from a place of overwhelming love, only made the stubborn situation more complicated. They were both so incredibly stubborn, so fiercely passionate about their own entirely valid perspectives, V needing nourishment to survive and Jimin needing discipline to succeed, that they completely refused to back down, resulting in a heavy, suffocating Cold War where they allegedly did not speak to each other for over 2 full days. This created a deeply uncomfortable, agonizingly awkward atmosphere in their incredibly cramped single-room dorm, where the other 5 members literally had to tiptoe around them like walking on incredibly fragile, broken glass, praying the tension would break. For a brief, terrifying moment, the unbreakable, universally adored soulmate bond between the 95-liners felt genuinely fractured, leaving fans to wonder in retrospect what terrible things would have happened if they had let this incredibly silly resentment fester and rot their beautiful friendship from the inside out. But here is the truly magical, profoundly beautiful twist that turns this ridiculous, petty fight into an absolute masterpiece of emotional storytelling and vulnerability. Instead of letting the dumpling incident become a dark, embarrassing secret desperately buried in the past, Jimin and V eventually sat down, got incredibly emotional, cried their eyes out, hugged it out, and completely poured their vulnerable, hurting hearts out to each other. They powerfully realized that their intense friction was actually just a messy, chaotic byproduct of their deep, unconditional love for the group and their desperate mutual desire to succeed together. Years later, they brilliantly and bravely immortalized this exact absurd fight in their incredibly touching, fan-favorite duet song called Friends, officially co-written and produced by Jimin himself, where they literally, joyfully sing the iconic lyrics, "The dumpling incident is a comedy movie," permanently cementing their most embarrassing, explosive teenage argument into a beautiful, platinum-selling musical monument to their brotherhood. It's a stunning, deeply reflective reminder that behind the flawless makeup, the perfectly synchronized choreography, and the untouchable, godlike superstar personas, these global icons are fundamentally just deeply human, incredibly flawed brothers who get exhausted, get hungry, and sometimes completely lose their minds over a cheap bag of convenience store food. This story vividly illustrates the raw, unfiltered humanity that makes BTS so deeply beloved worldwide. They simply don't hide their messy, ugly moments. They weave them into their art and share them with the world, proving that true, enduring bonds aren't formed by magically avoiding conflict, but by surviving the absolute worst, most ridiculous fights and choosing to profoundly love each other anyway. But if you think a massive, emotionally devastating war over a simple bag of dumplings is the absolute peak of BTS's unbelievable behind-the-scenes drama, just wait until we uncover the intense, desperately heart-wrenching moment in number 5, a terrifying, pivotal day where one utterly crucial member actually packed his bags, walked out the door, and officially quit the group forever, leaving a devastatingly tearful teenager to literally beg for his return and miraculously save the band from completely falling apart before they even truly began.
Number 5. J-Hope, The Devastating Departure, a tearful plea that saved the group.
When you look at the absolute global phenomenon that BTS is today, radiating blinding positivity, unmatched energy, and an unbreakable bond of brotherhood that seems almost incredibly scripted, it is practically impossible to imagine a reality where the group's literal sunshine, the fiercely talented dance captain, and the emotional anchor of the team actually packed his bags and officially walked away from it all. But that is exactly the devastating, spine-chilling reality we are diving into right now. We are taking you back to the grueling, desperately uncertain pre-debut days, long before the sold-out stadiums, the private jets, the presidential envoys, and the historic Grammy performances. Back to a terrifying, claustrophobic era when Big Hit Entertainment was a tiny, struggling agency, constantly teetering on the very edge of total, irreversible bankruptcy. The trainees were living in an incredibly cramped, desperately unglamorous single-room dorm in Nanhyundong, where they literally slept shoulder to shoulder on the hard floor, breathing in each other's exhausted sighs, dodging massive mosquitoes in the humid Korean summer, surviving on cheap convenience store ramen and leftover snacks, and constantly waking up to the terrifying, heart-stopping reality that their debut could be entirely canceled at any given moment by executives who simply ran out of money. In this suffocating, intensely high-pressure environment, Jungkook, universally known and adored by the world today as the incredibly radiant and flawlessly talented J-Hope, was carrying a massive, crushing mountain of invisible burdens on his young, fragile shoulders. Coming from a fiercely competitive underground street dance background in Gwangju, he wasn't just another generic trainee hoping for a lucky break. He was the absolute backbone of their grueling dance practices, the strict but deeply loving choreographer who stayed up until the early hours of the morning, sacrificing his own desperately needed sleep to make sure everyone's angles were perfectly sharp. And more importantly, he was the emotional glue that kept the wildly different, often clashing personalities of the team from completely shattering under the immense, crushing weight of their incredibly uncertain future. But even the absolute brightest, most enduring lights can eventually flicker and burn out when surrounded by total, unrelenting darkness. The chronic, bone-deep physical exhaustion, the immense psychological agony of endless, repetitive training with no clear end in sight, the complete lack of financial stability, and the terrifying, creeping doubt that all of this intense suffering might ultimately lead absolutely nowhere, finally pushed Hoseok to his absolute breaking point, leading to a fateful, agonizingly painful day where he made the brutally difficult, tear-soaked decision to let go of his lifelong dream, officially quit the agency, and leave the group forever. The atmosphere in that tiny, suffocating dorm room on the day he officially announced his heartbreaking departure was thick with absolute devastation, stunned disbelief, and a profound, paralyzing sense of panic that threatened to derail the entire project. Imagine the sheer, heart-wrenching cinematic tragedy of the scene. A deeply exhausted Hoseok, his face heavily stained with guilt and sorrow, slowly packing his meager belongings into his worn-out bags, quietly preparing to walk out the door and leave behind the boys he had bled, sweat, and cried with for years. The emotional epicenter of this absolute disaster was young Jungkook, the incredibly shy, deeply sensitive golden maknae who had left his family in Busan at an incredibly young age and essentially viewed the older members, especially Hoseok, as his protective surrogate brothers who raised him in the big, scary city. When the devastating, undeniable reality finally set in that his beloved Hung was actually leaving, Jungkook completely broke down, bursting into uncontrollable, agonizing tears, frantically grabbing on to Hoseok, weeping bitterly and pleading with all of his shattered heart for him not to leave, creating an intensely emotional, deeply traumatic memory that the members still speak about with incredibly heavy hearts and teary eyes to this very day on various talk shows and documentaries. But while Jungkook was desperately fighting the cruel reality with his tears, RM, the incredibly young but intensely visionary leader of the group, realized in a split second that he had to immediately step up and fight with his words, recognizing with absolute chilling clarity that without Jung Hoseok, the very soul, rhythm, and structural integrity of BTS would permanently, irreversibly collapse. RM didn't just sit around and mourn the loss. He aggressively stormed straight into the executive offices of Big Hit Entertainment, planting himself firmly in front of the intimidating company management, and delivered a desperate, impassioned do-or-die ultimatum that would fundamentally alter the course of pop music history. With raw, unshakable conviction and a fiery determination, RM looked the executives dead in the eye and emphatically declared, "We desperately need Jungkook. We absolutely cannot make it without him. If he doesn't debut with us, there is absolutely no BTS." Putting his own neck on the line, risking his own hard-fought, precarious position to desperately advocate for his brother. The agency, deeply moved and genuinely shocked by this intense, unprecedented display of raw leadership and unbreakable loyalty from a teenager, allowed RM to reach out to Hoseok one last time to try and miraculously bring him back from the brink of walking away forever. The exact tearful conversations that took place in that intensely critical window of time remain a sacred, heavily guarded secret between the members, a private testament to their bond. But the undeniable, universally known conclusion is one of the most beautiful, deeply profound moments in their entire legendary career. Hoseok returned. But when asked years later in a wildly emotional interview why he chose to come back to a struggling company that was literally broke and a dark future that was entirely unwritten, Hoseok didn't credit the agency, he didn't credit the faint, intoxicating promise of fame, and he didn't credit his own burning ambition for the music. He simply looked at his members with immense fondness and powerfully said, "I came back because I trusted you guys." That single, profoundly heavy sentence reveals the absolute core of why BTS conquered the world. They aren't just a group of random colleagues who were manufactured in a sterile corporate boardroom. They are deeply traumatized war buddies who stared into the absolute abyss of failure, actively chose each other over everything else, and built an impenetrable, globe-conquering brotherhood out of sheer desperate love and unyielding trust. If Hoseok had walked that dorm room door out and never looked back, if Jungkook hadn't shed those desperate begging tears, if RM hadn't fiercely defended his place, the intricate, perfectly balanced ecosystem of BTS would have been permanently, irreversibly destroyed before it even began, erasing the immense global impact, the historic, record-breaking achievements, and the life-saving comfort they have provided to millions of isolated people around the world. It is a wildly intense, intensely emotional true story that perfectly proves that the darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives are often just the universe desperately testing our resolve right before delivering a massive, world-altering miracle. But just when you think you've heard the absolute craziest, most intensely dramatic survival story of their pre-debut era, you need to firmly prepare yourself to have your mind completely blown by the next unbelievable entry on our list. Because what if I profoundly told you that one of the vital members was physically, intentionally hidden away from the world for so long that he genuinely believed he had been officially cut from the group, forced to live like a completely forgotten ghost in the very same dorm he was supposed to debut from? Who was this mysterious, deeply frustrated hidden weapon, and why on earth did the struggling agency subject him to such a bizarre, insanely stressful psychological experiment right before launching them to the entire world?
Number 4, Sugar, the secret delivery boy, a shattered shoulder and a hidden truth. While the legendary, heavily debated rumors of a physically hidden member often dominate the chaotic, endlessly fascinating pre-debut lore of BTS, there was actually another member who was fiercely hiding a much darker, far more agonizing, and intensely physical secret that genuinely almost ended his entire career before he ever even had the chance to step onto a stage. We are pulling back the glitzy, glamorous curtain to reveal the deeply painful, intensely traumatic, and fiercely inspiring untold story of Min Yoongi, universally revered today as the razor-sharp, fiercely independent rap genius and mastermind producer Sugar. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of his unbelievable sacrifice, we have to travel back to the gritty, unforgiving streets of Seoul during his intensely difficult trainee days, a time when the incredibly harsh reality of extreme poverty was constantly breathing down his neck.
Unlike some trainees whose parents fully supported their lofty artistic dreams, Yoongi had essentially left his hometown of Daegu with absolutely nothing but a fiery, unquenchable passion for music, facing profound, heartbreaking opposition from his own family who desperately wanted him to live a stable, normal, predictable life. Because Big Hit Entertainment was practically bankrupt at the time and completely unable to provide substantial financial support for their struggling trainees, Yoongi was forced to make a desperate, incredibly dangerous decision just to survive, eat, and pay his necessary school tuition. He secretly took on a grueling, high-risk part-time job as a motorcycle delivery boy every single night. After enduring agonizing, bone-crushing dance practices that lasted well past midnight, he would hop onto a cheap scooter, zipping through the chaotic, aggressively congested, and notoriously dangerous traffic of Seoul. He didn't dare tell his company or his fellow members about this secret, exhausting double life, absolutely terrified that they would demand he stop, or even worse, mercilessly kick him out for not being 100% completely focused on his grueling idol training. Then, one fateful, incredibly horrific rainy evening, the absolute worst-case scenario violently became a reality. While frantically trying to complete a late-night delivery on the slick, treacherous, rain-soaked asphalt, a car abruptly cut him off at an intersection, resulting in a terrifying, devastating crash that sent Yoongi flying violently off his motorcycle, slamming his fragile body heavily onto the unforgiving concrete. When he finally opened his eyes, completely disoriented, ears ringing loudly and gasping for breath in the middle of the street, he instantly felt a blinding, white-hot, excruciating agony radiating intensely from his shoulder. It was completely shattered, violently dislocated, and incredibly broken. In that terrifying, agonizing moment, lying in the wet, freezing rain, Yoongi wasn't thinking about the immense physical pain, nor was he worried about his overall long-term health. His brilliant mind instantly went to a place of pure, unadulterated panic regarding his lifelong musical dream. He was absolutely convinced, with chilling, heartbreaking certainty, that if he went back to his struggling agency and confessed that he had broken his body doing an illegal, secret part-time job, they would instantly label him as a massive liability, broken goods, and mercilessly kick him out of the highly competitive debut lineup, permanently destroying his only desperately fought chance at musical salvation. So, driven by sheer, desperate survival instinct and an unimaginably high threshold for pain, Yoongi made the wildly reckless, mind-boggling decision to completely lie. He dragged his battered, bruised, and broken body back to their cramped, humid dorm and casually told everyone, with a forced, incredibly convincing smile, that he had simply tripped and fallen down a flight of stairs, dramatically downplaying the horrific, bone-shattering severity of his devastating injury. What followed were months of absolute, literal, agonizing torture. Imagine the sheer, unbelievable, superhuman willpower it takes to participate in massive, grueling, high-intensity hip-hop choreography sessions, heavily involving intense floor work, acrobatic tricks, and aggressive arm movements. With a completely shattered, fundamentally untreated shoulder, Yoongi would secretly tape his shoulder incredibly tight in the bathroom stalls, bite his tongue until it practically bled to stop himself from screaming out loud, and force his agonizingly broken body to perfectly execute every single sharp, explosive dance move alongside his completely oblivious members. He was secretly crying in absolute agony in the dark corners of the studio when no one was looking, desperately hiding his intensely wincing, pale face behind his heavy, oversized hoodies. He was essentially a walking, dancing ghost of immense pain, pushing his fragile physical limits to the absolute brink of total collapse every single day, completely terrified that any microscopic sign of weakness or hesitation would mean instant, permanent elimination from the group he loved so fiercely. But eventually, the fragile human body can only endure so much profound, relentless abuse before it completely gives out. The pain became so unbelievably severe, so overwhelmingly debilitating that he could barely lift his arm to simply eat his meals or wash his own hair, completely forcing his back against the cold wall. With heavy, tear-filled eyes, a trembling voice, and a completely shattered, terrified heart, Yoongi finally broke down and confessed the entire agonizingly heavy truth to Bang Si-hyuk, the visionary founder of Big Hit Entertainment, fully packing his bags in his mind and expecting to be aggressively yelled at and immediately thrown out onto the unforgiving street. But in a stunning, incredibly beautiful and tear-jerking twist of fate that perfectly defines the unique, family-like core of the agency, Bang Si-hyuk didn't scream, he didn't get angry, and he certainly didn't fire him. Instead, he was deeply shocked and profoundly heartbroken that this incredibly talented, immensely driven young kid felt he had to suffer in absolute agonizing silence for so long, in an act of incredible, life-changing grace that forever cemented Yoongi's absolute, unwavering, ironclad loyalty to the company. Bang Si-hyuk immediately paid for his entire extensive medical treatment out of his own pocket, fully covered his pending stressful school tuition, and gently, warmly told him to take all the necessary time he needed to heal, strongly assuring him that his designated place in BTS was permanent, vital, and entirely safe. He stayed, he fiercely debuted, and he went on to conquer the entire global music industry, famously documenting this incredibly dark period in his legendary, intensely personal solo track, The Last, under his alter ego, August D. But the truly insane, mind-blowing, and deeply awe-inspiring part of this story is that the devastating, traumatic shoulder injury never actually fully healed. For over 8 incredibly long, grueling years, throughout multiple massive, sold-out global world tours, historic, record-breaking Grammy performances, and unimaginably intense choreography routines, Suga quietly, stoically endured chronic, agonizing pain, silently receiving regular, painful injections just to physically get through massive stadium shows without complaining to the fans, until the cartilage was so severely torn that he finally had to undergo major, career-threatening surgery in late 2020. This utterly insane, deeply heartbreaking, and fiercely heroic story is the ultimate, undeniable testament to the absolute blood, sweat, and literal tears that aggressively built the colossal BTS empire. It profoundly proves that their global, unprecedented success wasn't magically handed to them on a silver platter. It was aggressively, painfully ripped from the very jaws of absolute despair by brave young men who were literally, unapologetically willing to break their own bones and suffer in total, agonizing silence just for a single, fleeting chance to have their voices heard by the world. But if you think secretly surviving a horrific motorcycle crash and fiercely dancing with a shattered shoulder for almost a decade is the absolute peak of unbelievable cinematic BTS history, you need to firmly brace yourself and hold on tight for our next completely mind-blowing entry. Because what if I profoundly told you that the entire existence of this legendary group and the very foundation of their multi-billion-dollar legacy almost completely vanished in a split second because of a single deeply controversial and intensely risky decision made by a teenager who was being heavily, aggressively scouted by literally every single major entertainment powerhouse in the country? Who was this highly coveted, incredibly talented prodigy, and why on earth did he absolutely reject guaranteed fame, massive wealth, and top-tier agencies to blindly join a struggling, broke, and completely unknown company in the basement?
Number 3. Jungkook, the 7-agency bidding war, a leap of faith for a rapping stranger. Imagine for a second being a completely introverted, incredibly shy 13-year-old kid from the beautiful coastal city of Busan. A kid so intensely timid that he would literally wait until all of his older fellow trainees completely fell asleep just so he could sneak out and take a quick shower in absolute peace without anyone looking at him. Yet simultaneously possessing a raw, unpolished, and unbelievably massive talent that instantly makes you the single most intensely coveted, highly sought-after teenage prodigy in the entire cutthroat history of the fiercely competitive South Korean entertainment industry. We are aggressively pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on the absolutely mind-boggling cinematic origin story of Jungkook, universally celebrated today as the flawless, fiercely talented golden maknae of BTS, and uncovering the legendary, jaw-dropping tale of the unprecedented 7-agency bidding war that almost completely altered the entire trajectory of global pop music as we absolutely know it.
The year is fundamentally 2011, and a very young, wide-eyed, and slightly awkward Jungkook decides to bravely take a massive, terrifying leap of faith by auditioning for the incredibly popular, heavily televised national singing competition show called Superstar K3. Dressed in oversized, unremarkable street clothes and intensely avoiding eye contact with the glaring, intimidating television cameras, he softly and nervously sings a beautiful rendition of 2AM's hit ballad, This Song, effortlessly showcasing a uniquely breathtaking, deeply emotional vocal tone that was completely uncharacteristic and wildly advanced for someone of his incredibly young, inexperienced age. However, in a bizarre, almost unbelievable twist of fate that perfectly proves reality television judges absolutely do not always know best, he is unceremoniously quickly eliminated from the show before he even makes it to the actual television broadcast, his bright dreams seemingly crushed into tiny, invisible pieces right on the spot in front of ruthless producers. But while the careless television editors completely missed the sheer, undeniable magic standing right in front of them, the highly trained, fiercely predatory eyes of the elite K-pop casting directors silently lurking in the shadowy background absolutely did not miss a single beat. Almost immediately after he walked off that intensely disappointing audition stage, an incredibly chaotic, frenzied, and aggressively intense bidding war secretly exploded behind completely closed doors across the city of Seoul. Jungkook's cheap flip phone practically started melting in his hands as he was aggressively bombarded with direct, highly lucrative scouting offers from an astonishing 7 different major entertainment agencies, including absolute industry titans and massive wealthy powerhouses like JYP Entertainment, FNC, Woollim, Starship, Cube, and TS Entertainment. These were incredibly massive, highly successful, and deeply established companies with towering, gleaming glass-fronted skyscrapers in the richest districts of Seoul, possessing massive, bottomless financial budgets, fleets of tinted luxury vans, and a practically guaranteed, shiny gold-paved path to instant television fame, unimaginable wealth, and undeniable top-tier celebrity status. Any rational, logical, heavily advised teenager, and certainly any deeply concerned, protective parent who desperately wants the absolute best, most secure future for their child, would have instantly blindly signed a binding contract with one of these massive, glittering corporate giants without a single fleeting moment of hesitation. But mixed in with this towering, intimidating stack of incredibly flashy, elite business cards was one deeply unremarkable, incredibly plain, and almost sad-looking card from a tiny, practically unknown, and intensely broke company called Big Hit Entertainment. To truly understand the absolute, unadulterated madness of what happened next, you have to deeply realize that Big Hit at this specific time wasn't just small. It was fiercely struggling to simply keep its basement lights on, constantly teetering on the terrifying edge of total bankruptcy, operating out of a cramped, damp, badly ventilated underground studio space that constantly smelled like stale sweat, wet shoes, and cheap convenience store ramen, with absolutely zero guarantee that they would ever have enough actual funds to successfully debut a new idol group, let alone propel them to stardom. Yet against every single shred of conventional, sane logic, against the overwhelming, seductive pressure of massive corporate wealth, and against the perfectly paved, incredibly easy road to guaranteed mainstream success, young Jungkook decided to physically visit this tiny, intensely struggling agency out of sheer, innocent curiosity. As he quietly walked down the narrow, dimly lit, creaky stairs into the cramped underground studio, his deeply curious, wide doe eyes instantly locked on to a tall, intensely focused teenager wearing dreadlocks who was aggressively, passionately rapping into a cheap microphone with a sheer, unbridled, explosive energy and a fierce, raw rhythm that Jungkook had literally never witnessed before in his entire sheltered young life. That fiercely passionate, intimidating underground rapper was none other than Kim Namjoon, the brilliant teenage prodigy who would eventually become the legendary visionary leader RM. In that exact, massive, profoundly life-altering split second, quietly watching Namjoon drop breathtaking poetic rhymes with an undeniably cool, deeply hypnotic aura that completely commanded the tiny, broken room, Jungkook was completely, utterly mesmerized to his very core. He absolutely didn't see the peeling, water-damaged paint on the dark basement walls. He didn't care about the total lack of shiny corporate funding or fancy cafeterias, and he completely, recklessly ignored the massive, guaranteed safety nets offered by the towering, multi-million-dollar agencies waiting for his call. He simply saw an incredibly cool, intensely inspiring, larger-than-life older brother figure that he desperately, unconditionally wanted to follow, learn from, and create timeless music with. Driven entirely by a pure, gut-wrenching, unexplainable, instinctual feeling that completely defied all rational human logic, 13-year-old Jungkook made the wildly absurd, intensely shocking decision to absolutely reject all the massive, wealthy, highly established powerhouse agencies and formally signed a grueling trainee contract with the broke, completely unknown company in the damp basement solely and exclusively because he thought Kim Namjoon was the absolute coolest person he had ever seen on Earth. The sheer, immense, terrifying butterfly effect of this incredibly impulsive, deeply emotional teenage decision is completely, utterly staggering to fully comprehend when you look at the global landscape today. If Jungkook had rationally chosen JYP Entertainment, he most likely would have debuted as a core, central member of GT7, completely, irreversibly altering the dynamic of that highly successful group and forever changing his own destiny. If he had gone to any of the other massive agencies, the golden maknae of BTS, the absolute flawless vocal and physical center who miraculously and perfectly bridges the intense gap between the aggressive rap line and the soaring vocal line, simply would not exist, and the perfectly balanced, intensely magical synergy that aggressively catapulted BTS to absolute, unprecedented global domination would never ever be born into this world. He literally bet his entire young life, his precious fleeting youth, and his fiercely ambitious dreams on a complete stranger he saw in a dark, sweaty room, actively, bravely choosing the hardest, most terrifyingly uncertain path simply out of sheer, unadulterated artistic respect and instant, unbreakable admiration. It is a wildly dramatic, deeply poetic true story that violently shatters the incredibly cynical, highly manufactured illusion of the incredibly cutthroat K-pop idol industry, profoundly proving that sometimes the most massive, culturally dominant, multi-billion-dollar empires in the entire world are absolutely not built in sterile, calculating, cold boardrooms by wealthy suits-wearing executives, but instead are passionately forged in damp, intensely humid basements by starry-eyed kids who blindly, fiercely trust the raw, undeniable magic of genuine human connection and raw, unfiltered talent.
Number 2, RM, the 30% chance, a heart that beat death to change the world. When we look at the monumental, awe-inspiring figure of Kim Namjoon today, universally respected as the brilliant, fiercely intellectual leader of the biggest musical act on the planet, addressing the United Nations Assembly with effortless grace, engaging in profound philosophical discussions with global leaders, and constantly radiating an aura of impenetrable, bulletproof strength, it is almost impossible to imagine him as anything other than an absolute towering titan of modern pop culture. We see the sharp suits, the dimpled, reassuring smile, and the commanding stage presence that can easily control a screaming stadium of 90,000 people with a single subtle flick of his wrist. But behind the brilliant, platinum-selling lyrical mastery and the unshakable, rock-solid leadership lies a deeply intimate, chillingly terrifying, and incredibly traumatic personal history that is almost never fully grasped by the casual observer. A harrowing, life-or-death survival story that brutally grounds the godlike superstar back into the fragile, vulnerable realm of human mortality.
We are aggressively pulling you back to a very dark, desperately uncertain time long before the creation of BTS, long before the fame, the wealth, and the historic Billboard records, to a terrifyingly sterile, blindingly white hospital room in South Korea where a very young, incredibly frightened 15-year-old boy named Kim Namjoon was forced to stare directly, unflinchingly into the cold, unforgiving face of his own imminent death. When he was just a teenager, a time when most kids are only worried about awkward school crushes, looming final exams, and figuring out what video games to play on the weekend, Namjoon was violently diagnosed with a severe, potentially fatal, and incredibly dangerous heart condition that required immediate, highly invasive open-heart surgery. To truly understand the absolute, unadulterated terror of this moment, you have to deeply realize the horrific, chilling medical statistics that the doctors grimly laid out before his devastated, fiercely terrified parents. They explicitly, bluntly stated that young Namjoon had only a horrifyingly small, minuscule 30% chance of actually surviving the extremely complex medical procedure. Just sit with that incredibly heavy, suffocating fact for a moment. A massive, terrifying 70% chance that this brilliant, poetry-loving, desperately passionate kid would simply close his eyes on that cold stainless steel operating table and absolutely never open them again. A 70% chance that the visionary leader who would one day single-handedly hold the intricate, fragile universe of BTS together, write lyrics that would literally save millions of isolated, depressed youths from the brink of despair, and miraculously inspire a 13-year-old Jungkook to reject massive wealth and join a broke basement agency, would become nothing more than a tragic, heartbreaking, deeply unfair memory for a grieving family in Ilsan. As Namjoon lay on that terrifying hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lights glaring aggressively into his eyes, surrounded by the terrifying rhythmic beeping of clinical heart monitors, he wasn't thinking about global domination or Grammy Awards. He was thinking about the incredibly precious, desperately fleeting nature of time, fiercely agonizing over all the unwritten lyrics trapped in his brilliant mind, all the underground hip-hop stages he hadn't yet conquered, and the profound, deeply crushing fear of simply vanishing from the earth without leaving a meaningful, lasting mark. But miracles, as they say, are often born in the absolute darkest, most terrifyingly bleak moments of human existence. Against all the horrific medical odds, against the chilling 70% probability of total failure, and against the very cruel, unpredictable nature of human mortality, Namjoon's remarkably resilient, fiercely stubborn heart miraculously kept beating, aggressively pulling him back from the icy brink of the abyss and allowing him to slowly, painfully open his eyes to a completely fundamentally changed universe. Surviving an ordeal of this immense, terrifying magnitude at such a fragile, formative age did not just leave him with a massive physical surgical scar on his chest, it completely, irreversibly rewired his entire psychological and philosophical outlook on human existence, gifting him with a profound, almost supernatural sense of urgency and a fiercely burning, unstoppable desire to live absolutely every single second of his borrowed life entirely on his own terms. He famously, bravely immortalized this deeply traumatic, life-altering experience in the incredibly raw, heavily aggressive intro track, Oh, RUL 82, where he fiercely, breathlessly raps the iconic, deeply personal lines, "My heart stopped when I was 9 or 10. Put your hand on your heart and ask what your dream was," transforming his darkest, most terrifying medical trauma into an explosive, aggressively loud battle cry for an entire generation to wake up, stop living a deeply hollow, manufactured life dictated by strict societal expectations, and fiercely chase their own true, unfiltered passions before it is too late. This chilling, deeply awe-inspiring survival story completely explains exactly why RM is the ultimate, unbreakable backbone of BTS. When you have already literally fought the Grim Reaper and miraculously won your own life back against a staggering 70% chance of death, the immense, crushing pressure of debuting in a broke agency, the toxic, aggressive hate comments from vicious internet trolls, and the terrifying, immense weight of global superstardom all seem incredibly, wonderfully trivial in comparison. His leadership is profoundly rooted in the absolute, undeniable fact that he views every single day, every single song, and every single breathless performance as a beautifully fragile, miraculously gifted second chance at life, a second chance that he refuses to waste or take for granted. He is not just an idol, he is a literal walking medical miracle who violently cheated death to profoundly heal the broken hearts of millions across the globe with his uniquely empathetic, intensely philosophical worldview. But just when you absolutely believe that we have reached the very peak of intense, deeply emotional, tear-jerking BTS history, you must desperately brace yourself for our final, incredibly explosive, and genuinely mind-blowing entry in this countdown. Because what if I told you that the absolute biggest, most successful, and seemingly impenetrable musical act on the entire planet actually sat down in a room, looked each other dead in the eye, and officially, seriously decided to completely disband and permanently walk away from it all at the exact blinding peak of their historic, unprecedented global domination? Who broke down in front of millions of screaming fans to confess this deeply hidden, incredibly shocking secret? And how did they miraculously pull themselves back from the absolute edge of total, devastating destruction? Number 1. Jin, The Tears of 2018, a breakdown at the peak, the end that almost was. Imagine reaching the absolute dizzying pinnacle of your wildest, most impossible childhood dreams, standing gloriously at the very top of the world, bathed in the blinding golden lights of unprecedented global superstardom, completely untouched by any competition, only to look at your 6 best friends and seriously, painfully contemplate burning the entire empire to the ground and permanently walking away forever. We have finally arrived at the absolute top of our mind-blowing countdown, and we are fiercely uncovering the most heavily guarded, deeply terrifying, and profoundly heart-wrenching secret in the entire history of this legendary septet. A chilling moment centered around their beautiful, immensely strong eldest brother, Kim Suk-jin, universally adored as Jin. The year is 2018, and to the completely oblivious, intensely cheering outside world, BTS is not just a musical group anymore. They are untouchable, godlike titans of pop culture who are rapidly conquering the globe at a terrifying, breakneck speed. They are smashing historic Billboard records, attending elite American award shows, delivering wildly profound speeches at the United Nations, completely selling out massive international arenas in mere minutes, and basically achieving a level of monumental, stratospheric success that no South Korean artist had ever even dared to dream of in the entire history of the incredibly cutthroat music industry. From the glossy, heavily edited outside perspective, they were living an absolute, flawless fairy tale, completely dripping in massive wealth, universal adoration, and unstoppable momentum. But behind the perfectly synchronized, razor-sharp choreography, behind the dazzling million-dollar music videos, and behind their bright, reassuring smiles, an entirely different, incredibly dark, and suffocatingly terrifying reality was fiercely tearing them apart from the inside out. The sheer, crushing, unimaginable gravity of their sudden, colossal fame had become a monstrous, invisible weight bearing down heavily on their fragile human shoulders. They were violently stripped of their privacy, constantly scrutinized by millions of demanding, critical eyes, completely exhausted from agonizing, never-ending global schedules, and deeply, intensely terrified of making even the microscopic, slightest mistake that could instantly bring their entire towering legacy crashing down in a brutal avalanche of public cancellation. The immense, paralyzing fear of the massive pedestal they had been placed upon became so incredibly toxic, so overwhelmingly suffocating that early in that very year, the 7 members actually sat down together in a heavily guarded, strictly private room, looked each other dead in their exhausted, bloodshot eyes, and engaged in a deeply serious, incredibly agonizing, and tear-soaked discussion about officially, permanently disbanding the group. Yes, you heard that absolutely right. At the exact blinding zenith of their historic, unprecedented career, when practically every single musical artist on the entire planet desperately wanted to be them, BTS was intensely, painfully ready to completely quit, surrender their massive crowns, and permanently vanish into the quiet shadows just to miraculously save their own violently deteriorating mental health and protect their fragile sanity. They were practically running on absolute empty fumes, incredibly broken, profoundly traumatized by the immense pressure, and actively drafting their own devastating conclusion. For an entire, incredibly long year, they fiercely hid this dark, heavy, soul-crushing secret from their passionate management, from the ravenous global media, and most agonizingly from their millions of desperately devoted fans who completely relied on them for daily emotional survival. They continued to smile brightly for the flashing cameras. They continued to fiercely dance until their muscles screamed in absolute agony. And they continued to release chart-topping multi-platinum hits, all while quietly bleeding out internally and standing dangerously close to the absolute edge of total, irreversible destruction. But then came the fateful, deeply cinematic and fiercely unforgettable night of December 14th, 2018 at the massive, highly publicized Mnet Asian Music Awards in Hong Kong. BTS had just been gloriously announced as the ultimate winners of the highly coveted, intensely prestigious Artist of the Year award, the absolute highest honor of the entire night. As the 7 beautifully dressed, physically exhausted members slowly walked up to the brightly lit, massive stage to accept their gleaming trophy amidst the deafening, ear-piercing screams of thousands of adoring fans, nobody in that massive arena had absolutely any idea of the massive emotional time bomb that was about to violently explode. Jin, the incredibly handsome, fiercely protective eldest brother, who is famously universally known for his bright, goofy, ice-breaking humor and deeply positive, radiant energy, slowly approached the microphone to deliver their acceptance speech. But instead of the usual, polished, deeply expected corporate thank yous, Jin's beautiful face suddenly crumbled, his voice started violently shaking, and tears began to heavily stream down his cheeks as he decided to bravely, recklessly shatter the perfect idol illusion and aggressively rip open their deeply hidden, unhealed wounds for the entire globe to witness. With a fiercely trembling voice, completely ignoring the strict, highly manufactured rules of the K-pop industry, Jin dramatically confessed to the entire screaming world that earlier that year they had suffered so incredibly much mentally, they had endured such profound, crushing hardship that they had seriously, genuinely considered completely disbanding and permanently walking away from it all. The very second those incredibly heavy, heartbreaking words left Jin's trembling lips, the entire massive arena went completely, chillingly numb. The sheer, unadulterated shockwaves of that brutal, deeply terrifying confession instantly rippled through the global audience like a massive, devastating earthquake. Next to him on the stage, the emotional dam completely broke. Taehyung instantly buried his face in his hands, violently, uncontrollably sobbing with his entire body aggressively shaking, so heavily overwhelmed by the massive release of that tightly guarded, intensely painful secret that his legs practically gave out. Jimin deeply, desperately threw his arm around RM, tightly gripping his leader as if his life entirely depended on it, while Jungkook aggressively tilted his head back, desperately trying to stop his own heavy, agonizing tears from falling, and even the usually stoic, fiercely composed Suga intensely wiped his heavily watering eyes. It was a raw, incredibly messy, violently emotional, and profoundly beautiful display of unfiltered human vulnerability that completely defied every single strict rule of television broadcasting. Jin, acting as the ultimate, profoundly brave shield for his younger brothers, took the massive, terrifying bullet of public confession, bravely admitting their darkest, most shameful weakness so they could finally, miraculously heal. He concluded his deeply legendary, historically significant speech by beautifully, tearfully thanking his beloved members for miraculously finding the sheer, undeniable strength to tightly hold on to each other, bravely fighting through the absolute darkest, most terrifying storm of their lives, and actively, fiercely choosing to stay together against all the impossible odds. They didn't disband. Instead, they forged an entirely new, deeply impenetrable armor out of their shared trauma, bravely renewing their contract and aggressively promising to walk down that terrifying, blindingly bright path hand in hand, no matter how incredibly heavy the golden crown became. This intensely dramatic, wildly emotional true story perfectly encapsulates the absolute, undeniable core of BTS's legendary global power. Their immense strength does not come from magically being bulletproof from the very start. It completely, profoundly comes from having been heavily, brutally shot down by the immense pressure of the world, violently bleeding out on the floor, and miraculously, beautifully choosing to painfully stand back up together, stronger and more fiercely united than ever before. As we finally close out this mind-blowing, deeply inspiring Top 7 countdown, one must profoundly stop and aggressively question the very nature of the entertainment we consume. If the absolute biggest, most successful, immensely wealthy artists on the entire planet can nearly be completely destroyed by the invisible, crushing weight of public expectation and massive fame, how heavily are we judging the fragile human beings behind the glossy screens every single day? Are we truly witnessing the glamorous, flawless reality of our favorite shining superstars? Or are we simply blindly watching incredibly brave, deeply traumatized survivors violently fighting for their absolute sanity under the blinding, unforgiving stage lights? What other massive, earth-shattering secrets are still quietly hiding behind the perfectly curated smiles of the global elite, waiting to finally explode?